The instructors led the group of cadets along the ridge in silence, allowing the grim landscape below to speak for itself. The valley stretched beneath them like a wounded beast, covered in layers of drifting volcanic smoke that never fully cleared, even when the wind whipped across the jagged cliffs. The haze pulsed and rolled with every faint tremor from the ground, rising in sluggish waves that stained the air a dull gray. Most cadets instinctively pulled their masks tighter, even though the ridge was considered safe. The mere sight of the valley made breathing feel heavier. Daniel, the only human trainee in the group, stood near the edge without flinching and watched the smoky patterns swirl and collapse as if the valley were exhaling slow, exhausted breaths. An instructor raised his voice, echoing against the rock walls. He announced that the valley had been classified uninhabitable decades earlier. Toxic particulates, unstable airflow, and unpredictable heat vents had rendered it unfit for settlement, research stations, or even temporary shelters. Smoke pooled inside it like water in a cracked basin, absorbing heat in the day and releasing it in bursts at night. The ground was pitted with old magma channels that still radiated warmth, though none of the cadets knew enough geology to understand how active the valley really was. They only knew it was dangerous. Daniel listened quietly, his attention drifting more toward the movements of the fog than the warnings themselves. Some cadets whispered to one another about stories they had heard. Explorers who stepped inside and collapsed within minutes, drones that malfunctioned because their sensors clogged with ash, hunters who followed beasts into the haze only to return coughing blood. The instructor confirmed some of these tales, but dismissed the more dramatic ones as exaggeration. He explained that the environment was simply unsuitable for breathing without mechanical filters. The cadets nodded, comforted by the authority of someone who had never personally spent more than 5 minutes inside the valley. Daniel had no desire to question him aloud, yet something in the instructor's tone stirred a quiet spark of skepticism in him. Daniel crouched and picked up a handful of ridge dust while the others kept their distance. The dust felt dry, brittle, and unusually heavy. When he let it fall through his fingers, it drifted downward and vanished into the fog like drops into a river. The smoke swallowed everything gently. It did not lash or burn the way the cadets imagined. It moved with a strange softness, like breath moving through a sleeping throat. Daniel narrowed his eyes and studied the faint changes in color and density. The valley was not uniform. Some patches of smoke were thinner, some thicker, some moving faster than others. To Daniel, that meant something important. Airflow existed down there. It was not random chaos. It followed rules. The instructor resumed his explanation and pointed at several markers placed along the ridge. Each sign warned anyone approaching the valley that extended exposure would cause lung damage, disorientation, and risk of collapse. Daniel stepped closer to one of the signs out of curiosity. The metal had rusted unevenly, leaving streaks through the faded wording. Toxic zones often damaged metal quickly, but Daniel noted that the rust was mostly superficial. The sign had survived many years without crumbling. That meant the smoke had certain properties the Academy had overlooked or misinterpreted. It was not corrosive in the way many believed. Daniel tucked that observation into his mind, letting it settle there like a seed waiting for the right moment to sprout. As the group moved along the ridge, the valley shifted in appearance. In some sections, the smoke thinned to reveal cracked reddish stone beneath, shaped by ancient lava flows. In others, the fog thickened so heavily that the cadets could no longer see their own boots. Daniel paused whenever he noticed abrupt transitions, trying to understand why one area cleared while another smothered itself in haze. He followed the direction of the wind and listened to the low hum of the earth beneath his feet. Some of the cadets hurried ahead, eager to get away from the unsettling view. Daniel lingered, watching, studying, breathing slowly as he tried to memorize every detail. When the group reached the observation platform, the instructor explained the true purpose of the day's training. The cadets were to remain on the ridge for 24 hours, surviving with limited supplies while avoiding any descent into the valley. The challenge was meant to test strategic thinking, resource allocation, and cooperation. The valley itself was off limits, declared too dangerous to approach. The instructor emphasized that entering the smoke would result in immediate failure and potential harm. He looked directly at Daniel as he said it, perhaps expecting the human to be the one most likely to attempt something reckless. Daniel did not react. He simply observed the instructor's posture, the caution in his eyes, and the slight tremble that betrayed his own discomfort near the valley. Daniel turned his gaze outward again, letting the quiet roar of the drifting smoke fill his mind. He did not feel fear. He felt curiosity thick and warm, curling inside him like steam rising from a pot. The idea of an entire region declared uninhabitable fascinated him. Humans had a long history of solving problems that others considered hopeless. Every time Daniel heard the phrase, uninhabitable, something inside him automatically wondered, is it truly impossible or just unexplored? While the instructor dismissed the group to set up ridge camps, Daniel remained on the platform a moment longer. He closed his eyes and inhaled through his nose, tasting the air carefully. Even from the ridge, he could sense the difference between the valley smoke and the natural breeze above it. The smoke contained minerals, ash, and organic residue, but nothing that struck him as immediately lethal. His lungs prickled slightly, but not painfully. He shifted his weight and listened again to the wind pushing the fog in gentle arcs. The valley was breathing, just as the cadets were, only with a different rhythm. Several cadets watched Daniel with unease, whispering that he stood too close to the drop. One cadet muttered that humans were strange creatures who treated danger as a puzzle rather than a warning. Daniel ignored the voices. He traced the outline of the valley with his eyes, noting areas where the smoke thinned near certain rock formations. He imagined how air might flow if redirected, how particulates might settle if caught by improvised barriers, how pockets of clean space could form if given the right structures. The ideas came to him naturally, like water seeking a path. The sun shifted lower in the sky, staining the fog in shades of copper and gold. The valley looked less like a death trap and more like a massive engine waiting for someone to understand its mechanics. Daniel's heart beat with quiet certainty. He did not intend to break the rules out of arrogance or carelessness. He simply believed that no environment was beyond adaptation. Something within the haze called to him, not with menace, but with possibility. The instructor finally noticed Daniel still standing there and urged him to return to the ridge camp. Daniel nodded politely and stepped back, giving no hint of the decision forming in his mind. The warning signs, the thick fog, the whispered fears, all of it felt like an invitation rather than a barrier. As Daniel walked toward the others, he kept his gaze fixed on the valley below, already imagining what he could build inside a place that everyone else had abandoned to smoke and silence. He knew one thing with complete clarity. The Academy might have declared the valley uninhabitable, but he had not. The smoke was only a challenge, and challenges were meant to be solved. Daniel moved away from the observation platform with the same calm pace he had maintained since morning, but inside his mind, the shape of a clear, deliberate decision had already crystallized. He listened absently to the rustling of equipment as the other cadets unpacked their ridge supplies. Some were already arguing about where to place their tents. Others complained about the cold wind, and one was attempting to scan the valley with a handheld sensor that flickered wildly from interference. Daniel barely registered the noise. His thoughts spiraled down toward the fog-filled basin like an anchor sinking through dark water. Each step he took across the rocky ground only strengthened the quiet conviction rising inside him. The ridge offered safety, but safety had never been the point of this training. Understanding the world, any world, had always meant stepping into uncertainty. He crouched near the edge again and watched the thick smoke roll like restless surf against the valley walls. The sun had climbed high, heating the upper layer of haze just enough to shift its movement. The fog no longer drifted in slow, heavy waves, but instead curled upward in thin strands, sucked toward pockets where the air rose. Daniel observed each motion carefully. The patterns reminded him of fires he had tended during camping trips back on Earth. He had learned early in life that smoke never behaved randomly. It always followed the laws of airflow, temperature, and pressure. If someone understood those laws well enough, he could bend them, even in a hostile environment like this one. The instructor shouted for the cadets to assemble so he could review safety protocols again before withdrawing to a monitoring station. Daniel walked over with the group, though his eyes lingered on the shifting haze behind him. The instructor lectured about avoiding unnecessary risks and conserving energy. He emphasized cooperation and staying within designated boundaries. Some cadets nodded with exaggerated seriousness, eager to impress. Daniel remained expressionless. His mind was already pulling apart the problem of the valley, as if disassembling a device to study the parts inside. Toxic particulates were not an absolute obstacle. They were simply material that needed to be filtered, redirected, or neutralized. Airflow could be shaped. Heat could be harnessed. Nothing about the valley seemed as impossible as the instructor insisted. When the instructor dismissed the cadets to begin the challenge, Daniel did not walk toward the camping zone. Instead, he stepped back toward the ridge edge and studied the descent route carved by old landslides. The rock was uneven but stable enough to climb. The smoke below looked thickest in the center of the valley but thinner near the eastern slope. If he entered there, he could adjust to the conditions gradually rather than plunging into the densest fog immediately. His breathing remained steady as he pictured the path in his mind. He tightened the straps on his pack and checked the simple cloth bandana he carried, a tool most cadets dismissed as useless in a high-tech academy. Daniel saw it differently. Even a thin cloth, dampened properly, could catch a surprising amount of particulate matter. Human ingenuity relied not on advanced tools, but on the ability to make something effective out of whatever existed around him. One cadet noticed him standing near the edge and called out nervously, asking what he was doing. Daniel did not answer. He simply placed one hand on the rock and swung his leg over the ledge. Gasps rippled through the group, and several cadets shouted for him to stop, but Daniel had already begun his descent. The instructor spun around, shocked, and yelled for him to return to the ridge immediately. Daniel looked up long enough to acknowledge the voice, but did not climb back. He continued downward with careful, deliberate movements, as if climbing into a place forbidden only by superstition rather than fact. The ridge grew smaller above him, swallowed slowly by the rising haze. The voices blurred into indistinct echoes. Daniel kept his focus forward, choosing footholds with a calm precision that came from years of hiking difficult terrain. The air changed noticeably as he lowered himself into the valley. The smell of ash thickened, and the brightness of the sun dimmed behind a gray curtain. He paused occasionally to test the air with shallow breaths. The particulate density grew heavier but not immediately unbearable. His lungs prickled, but no sharp pain followed. He pressed the bandana over his nose and mouth, exhaled gently through the cloth, and felt the sensation ease slightly. The slope leveled out, and Daniel stepped fully onto the valley floor. Smoke curled around his legs and waist, like an animal investigating an intruder. The ground felt warm beneath his boots, fed by deep heat currents still lingering from volcanic activity centuries earlier. The warmth surprised him. It meant the valley's microclimate could support cooking, drying, or water purification if he learned how to manage it correctly. He ran his fingers lightly through the air and watched the smoke react. It parted in long, ribbon-like trails, revealing clearer pockets hidden within the haze. The valley was not uniform at all. It was a patchwork of danger and possibility. Daniel walked forward slowly, testing the air in each new section. In some areas, he needed to crouch to find clearer oxygen pockets where the particulates settled less densely. In others, he could stand at full height without discomfort. He noticed that plants coated in ash still clung stubbornly to certain rock crevices. Their leaves were pale and dry, but their shape suggested that the valley had once supported life. If it had done so before, it could do so again in the right conditions. Daniel knelt beside one of the plants and brushed away the accumulated ash. The leaf beneath was surprisingly intact. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect. The valley was harsh, not dead. He continued inward, guided by instinct and careful observation. The smoke grew thicker again, but Daniel remained calm. He stopped near a cluster of cracked stones where the fog repeatedly lifted before folding back down. A faint draft brushed against his cheek, stirring the upper layer of haze. Daniel closed his eyes to track the movement and recognized the pattern. The smoke was being pushed aside by a small, consistent airflow rising through a natural fissure in the ground. The valley was not stagnant. It was shaped by countless tiny vents and currents, all of which could be redirected with enough effort. He knelt and ran his hand along the fissure, feeling warm air pulse upward. This vent was strong enough to act as a natural chimney if he built the right structure around it. With proper placement of stones or branches, he could pull fresh air in from a lower angle and push contaminated air upward through the opening. The idea grew clearer in his mind with each breath. The valley did not need to be avoided. It needed to be engineered. Daniel stood again, adjusting the pack on his shoulders. He scanned the ground for materials and saw plenty. Stones of varying sizes, branches from long-dead trees, fibrous plants coated in ash, and patches of clay near the valley's edge. Everything he needed existed right here. Airflow could be shaped with vents. Particulates could be trapped with layered filters. Heat could be used for cooking, drying, or boiling water. The valley was not an uninhabitable wasteland. It was a workshop waiting for someone willing to get his hands dirty. He inhaled slowly, testing the air again. The prickling sensation in his lungs had not worsened. His bandana caught most of the ash when he exhaled. He felt steady, focused, and strangely energized. Above him, the ridge had vanished behind a solid curtain of smoke. The world up there no longer existed for him. The challenge ahead was here, inside the haze, inside the place everyone else feared. Daniel stepped deeper into the valley, guided by quiet purpose. He began gathering stones, sorting them by size and texture. He picked up strips of bark that could serve as primitive filters. He scooped clay into a small bundle to shape later. His movements grew more confident with each task. He did not rush. He worked with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that survival was not about strength, but about adaptability. He knew the cadets on the ridge were panicking. He knew the instructor was furious, confused, perhaps even terrified for him. None of that mattered. Daniel had come here to learn, and learning meant confronting the unknown directly. He would turn this valley, declared uninhabitable by caution and assumption, into a place where a human could work, breathe, and create. He did not wish to defy the academy. He simply wished to understand the world as it truly was, not as others believed it to be. The smoke curled around him like a living veil, but Daniel walked forward with unwavering resolve. The valley had accepted him, and now he would reshape it. Daniel stood in the heart of the valley with the haze shifting in restless loops around him, and for the first time since his descent, he felt the valley settle into a rhythm he could read with increasing clarity. He adjusted the bandana over his mouth, inhaled carefully, and began mapping the environment in his mind. Every swirl of smoke, every warm gust rising from beneath the stones, every pocket of clearer air formed a pattern. His job now was to turn those patterns into structures capable of filtering, redirecting, and controlling the valley's volatile atmosphere. If he could build even a small zone of breathable air, the rest would follow. He set down the materials he had already gathered and expanded his search methodically. The valley floor offered more resources than the ridge cadets could imagine. Daniel found clusters of fibrous plants that had somehow survived years of ashfall. When he rubbed the fibers between his fingers, he felt a strong, thread-like structure inside each strand, perfect for layering into filters. He bundled them tightly and tied them with strips of old bark. He continued walking until he found piles of smooth stones shaped by ancient heat. The stones varied in density. Some were porous, ideal for holding clay, while others were solid enough to serve as supports for walls or vents. He returned to the fissure where warm air pulsed upward in steady intervals. The vent was narrow but powerful, and Daniel understood immediately that this would become the core of his first filtration structure. He knelt beside it and cleared the surrounding area of loose debris. The ground radiated heat through his palms, confirming that internal pressure was pushing air upward at a predictable rate. He pressed his ear close to the opening and heard a faint vibration deep within the earth. It was not threatening. It was steady, like a heartbeat. Daniel began stacking stones around the vent, choosing pieces with flat edges to create a ring. He placed the largest stones at the base, allowing them to stabilize the structure, then built upward with smaller ones, leaving deliberate gaps for airflow. Once the ring reached knee height, he mixed clay with small amounts of moisture collected from his canteen. The clay thickened into a paste he could mold. He spread it along the inside of the stone ring, sealing cracks while leaving the vertical gaps exposed so that air could pass through but ash would be forced to settle. He stepped back to evaluate the airflow. The warm draft now rose through the gaps in distinct, narrow streams. Daniel leaned close and tested the air with cautious breaths. It still carried particulate matter, but significantly less than before. Progress. He collected the fibrous plants and wove them together into layered mats. He shaped each mat in a circular pattern large enough to cover the stone ring. The mats would act as the filter's first stage, trapping ash before it ascended through the clay-lined walls. He lowered the first mat onto the ring. The fibers trembled gently as warm air pushed upward, and the smoke above dispersed in a thin spiral. Daniel watched closely as the mat caught ash, turning its pale surface darker in seconds. A second mat placed above the first thickened the filtration effect. By stacking fibers and allowing each layer to catch smaller particles, Daniel began creating breathable pockets of air around the vent. It was not perfect, but it was enough for him to stand comfortably for several breaths at a time without feeling sharp irritation in his lungs. He continued refining the structure. He reinforced the walls with additional clay and used long branches to create a framework above the vent. The framework supported more mats, forming a multi-tier system where each level filtered the air progressively. Some of the mats he coated lightly with damp clay, increasing their ability to trap even finer particulates. The clay dried quickly in the heat, leaving a firm but permeable layer. Daniel tested the airflow again, lowering his face into the rising stream. The air that reached him now felt warm, but not harsh, and he could hold a steady breath without coughing. Encouraged, he expanded the system. He walked to another fissure several meters away, where smoke lifted in smaller, intermittent bursts. This vent was weaker, but it still offered potential. Daniel repeated the process, clearing the area, building a stone ring, applying clay, layering fibers, and constructing a tiered filter system above it. This vent required adjustments because its airflow fluctuated. Daniel observed the pattern for several minutes before placing the mats in a staggered formation that allowed for uneven bursts without overloading the filters. As he worked, he noticed the smoke around him beginning to shift. With two vents now filtering air, the surrounding haze thinned into delicate strands. He could finally see more than a few meters ahead. Shapes of rock formations emerged from behind the fog, and the once suffocating valley floor revealed paths and ridges he could not see earlier. Daniel moved between the vents and felt the temperature difference where clean air mixed with the ambient haze. Every improvement he made rippled outward, creating larger pockets of clarity. He walked along the newly visible path and found a spot where the smoke twisted sharply downward before rising again. It suggested a natural air pocket forming due to the uneven terrain. Daniel studied this phenomenon and realized he could use it to create a third filtration system, one designed to pull air sideways rather than upward. He collected stones and branches again, arranging them in a slanted structure that guided the descending smoke into a clay-lined trench. Inside the trench, he placed more fiber mats, allowing the smoke to pass horizontally through the filters before rising again. The result was crude but effective. The filtered air rose in smooth, clear columns that cut through the haze in gentle spirals. Daniel continued tirelessly, adjusting materials, reinforcing structures, and modifying the filters to increase efficiency. The valley responded with each new addition. Where once the smoke had formed a choking blanket, now distinct corridors of cleaner air began to emerge. Daniel followed these corridors, expanding them until he could move freely without needing to crouch for breath. He walked through the valley and watched the haze swirl around his filtration systems, reacting to the new airflow like an organism learning to breathe differently. Hours passed, measured not by sunlight, but by the changes in the smoke's behavior. When Daniel finally paused to rest, he stood inside a wide pocket of clear air, large enough for him to walk several steps in any direction without experiencing discomfort. The filtered air rose from the vents like warm pillars, lifting the haze into higher layers of the valley where it dispersed harmlessly. The ground beneath his boots felt cooler now that heat had channels to escape through. Daniel inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with air that no longer tasted metallic or abrasive. He surveyed the valley from his filtered pocket, imagining the steps ahead. He would need a larger clearance zone if he wanted to establish a functional shelter. He would need windbreaks and barriers to stabilize airflow. He would need cooking structures to take advantage of the valley's natural heat. But he had accomplished the most important step, proving that the valley could be reshaped. It was no longer a suffocating wasteland. It was a canvas. Daniel took another slow breath and felt a quiet satisfaction settle into his chest. The instructors and cadets up on the ridge believed the valley rejected life. They believed no one could breathe or function inside it without advanced equipment. Yet here he stood, surrounded by structures built from nothing but stone, clay, fibers, and instinct. Structures that had already transformed the air he breathed. He tightened the bandana once more, not out of desperation now, but out of habit, and walked toward the center of the valley. The filtered pockets followed him like lanterns cutting through the dark. He had built the beginnings of a system, primitive, fragile, but alive. And with this system in place, he could finally begin working on something more ambitious, turning the valley not only into a breathing space, but into a place where he could cook, work, and survive with comfort. The valley had taken its first breath through his hands. Now it was ready for the next transformation. Daniel moved deeper into the valley's interior with a sense of calm purpose, guided by the expanding pockets of filtered air that now followed his path like invisible companions. The structures he had built were still crude, but they breathed with the valley as if they had always belonged to the landscape. The haze curled and parted around them, opening trails that had never existed before. As Daniel traced these new pathways, he imagined how the valley might look once he completed his next objective, a fully functional cooking area that used the valley's natural heat and altered airflow. If he could achieve that, he would not merely survive here, he would thrive. He explored a shallow depression near the valley's center, a place where the ground radiated stronger warmth. He crouched and pressed his palm to the stone. The heat pulsed steadily, more consistent than the vents he had already used. He brushed aside loose ash and uncovered a patch of smooth rock marked by faint mineral streaks. The surface felt like the outer shell of a dormant furnace. Daniel knew immediately that this spot would become the core of his kitchen, a reliable heat source around which everything else could be built. He stood and surveyed the area. Smoke drifted overhead, but the filtered pockets had cleared enough space for him to breathe without strain. He walked in slow circles, determining airflow directions. The haze tended to drift to the left before rising sharply near a jagged ridge. That upward pull would help carry cooking smoke away once he established the fire structures. He knelt again and tapped the ground, listening for hollow tones. One spot produced a deep vibration, hinting at a cavity beneath. Daniel scraped away ash and found a narrow crack leading downward. The heat rising from it was intense but not dangerous. It would serve perfectly as the primary source for boiling and roasting. He gathered stones, selecting ones with flat surfaces that would stack efficiently. He arranged them in a ring around the heated crack, spacing the stones in a way that allowed warm air to escape upward through controlled channels. He reinforced the structure with clay, smoothing the inner walls until they resembled a primitive stove. When the clay hardened, the heat collected inside the ring and intensified. Daniel hovered his hand above the opening and felt steady warmth rising, strong enough to cook with but stable enough to manage. He smiled behind his bandana and imagined a pot resting over the opening, steam rising gently through the clear air. He moved on to gather long, sturdy branches from the valley's few remaining dead trees. The branches were dry and brittle, but strong enough to support woven mats. He arranged them into a tripod over the stone ring, tying the joints with strips of bark. From the tripod, he suspended a flat stone he had carefully chipped into a smoother surface. It would serve as a grill or drying surface. The stone absorbed the heat rising from below and warmed evenly. Daniel tested the temperature by scattering small plant fragments across it. The fragments curled and dried almost instantly, confirming that the setup would work. Daniel then searched for a water source. The valley was dry at the surface, but he knew that underground heat often condensed moisture along cooler rock layers. He followed the faint sound of dripping until he reached a narrow alcove where a thin line of water traced its way down the stone wall. He placed a container carved from a hollowed-out plant stalk beneath it. The water collected slowly but steadily. He tasted a single drop, noting the mineral tang that indicated it was safe after boiling. He carried the container back to his cooking area and poured some into a small metal cup he kept in his pack. The cup rested neatly on a stone ledge above the heating vent. Within minutes, the water began to simmer. As the water heated, Daniel explored nearby plants to determine which ones were edible. Many appeared lifeless under layers of ash, but when he cut one open with his small knife, he found the inner flesh moist and surprisingly fresh. Some plants contained sweet sap, others bitter juice rich in minerals. Daniel collected several samples and carried them back to the makeshift kitchen. He peeled the outer layers, slicing the inner portions into thin strips. He placed the strips on the heated stone, watching them sizzle softly as moisture evaporated. The smell that rose into the filtered air was faint, but pleasant, an herbal aroma that drifted upward and vanished into the higher layers of the haze. The valley felt transformed by the presence of warmth and scent. Smoke patterns shifted around the cooking zone, drawn upward through the altered airflow created by Daniel's earlier filtration systems. The combination of heat and clean air produced a zone that felt almost comfortable. Daniel took a slow breath, savoring the moment. He had created a place where he could prepare food and drink without struggling to breathe. It was far from perfect, but it was stable and functional, and that alone was remarkable given the conditions. Daniel decided to expand the kitchen further. He collected more clay and shaped it into small bowls, smoothing the surfaces with his thumbs. He set them near the hot stone ring to dry. He also created shallow pits around the area, filling them with ash and small stones. These pits would serve as secondary heating zones for slow cooking or drying ingredients. He placed a few pieces of plant matter into one of the pits and covered it with a clay sheet. The slow heat would preserve the food for later use. As he worked, Daniel felt the valley reacting to his presence in subtle ways. The haze swirled gently above the cooking structures, rising along the pathways formed by his filters. The ground vibrated softly under his feet, offering warmth with each pulse. Even the plants seemed to yield more readily when he pressed them for sap or sliced them open. It was as if the valley had accepted his efforts, acknowledging that he was not here to fight it, but to adapt to it. Daniel took another bundle of plant fibers and wove them into a heat-resistant mat. He placed the mat above the heated stone, allowing steam from the boiling water to rise through it. The mat softened but did not break, absorbing the moisture and drying quickly. It would serve as a steamer for more delicate ingredients. He tested the idea by placing thin slices of a sweet sap plant on the mat. The slices softened and released a fragrant aroma that drifted across the filtered pocket. The scent grew stronger, mixing with the gentle mineral warmth of the valley. Daniel inhaled deeply, feeling a faint smile form. The idea of turning the valley into a kitchen had felt bold at first, but now, standing among the structures he had built, Daniel felt a sense of grounded certainty. The valley's heat, once dangerous, had become a resource. The smoke, once suffocating, had been tamed into predictable patterns. The filtered air created a sense of calm that allowed him to focus fully on the craft of cooking. He felt the same peace he had once experienced while preparing meals during long hikes on Earth, when simplicity had been the essence of survival. As the first batch of steamed slices finished cooking, Daniel lifted one and tasted it carefully. The flavor surprised him. It was sweet with a hint of bitterness, complex but pleasant. It reminded him of wild herbs he had tried during mountain trips back home. He realized that even in a place abandoned by caution and fear, there was nourishment waiting to be found by anyone willing to try. He placed the cooked slices into one of the clay bowls, feeling satisfaction settle into his chest. Daniel returned to the boiling cup of water and added a few fragments of dried plant sap. The water darkened slowly, turning into a faintly aromatic broth. He took a sip, feeling warmth spread through him. It was simple and primitive, but in this valley, it tasted like triumph. He adjusted the tripod, reinforced the stone ring, and rearranged the mats to improve airflow. Every small improvement strengthened the kitchen's stability. The valley, once silent except for the whisper of toxic haze, now carried the sounds of simmering water, crackling ash, and the faint hiss of food cooking on heated stone. Daniel understood that this kitchen would become the heart of his work here. It was a symbol of transformation, of turning the forbidden into the functional. When he stepped back to examine everything he had built, he realized the valley no longer felt uninhabitable. It felt like a place that could support life, creativity, and comfort if treated with patience and respect. Daniel wiped ash from his hands, straightened the tripod, and prepared to craft more tools. The valley breathed around him, warm and alive, and he stood in the center of it, not as a desperate survivor, but as a craftsman ready to shape the next stage of his evolving camp. He knew the cadets above were watching the haze from a distance, imagining only danger. But down here, in the filtered light of his kitchen, Daniel felt something rare, the quiet certainty that he had proven the valley wrong. The filtered pockets of air drifted gently around Daniel as he prepared the final adjustments to his kitchen structures. The valley no longer felt like a suffocating trap. It felt alive, reshaped by his hands into something functional and strangely welcoming. The warmth rising from the vents, the shifting but manageable haze, the scent of cooked herbs, all of it created a quiet world where survival had become comfort. Daniel stepped back from the stove ring and observed the rising columns of clean air, which carried the aroma of his simmering broth upward in faint spirals. The scent rose through the haze and drifted toward the ridge like an unspoken invitation. He did not know whether anyone above would recognize the change, but he sensed that someone would eventually come looking for him. He ladled a small bowl of the warming broth into one of the clay containers he had shaped earlier. The bowl held its form well despite the heat. Daniel lifted it to his lips, tasting the slow-boiled blend of minerals and sap. The flavor had deepened since the first batch. The valley's resources responded to heat and time in ways that reminded him of wild cooking traditions passed down through generations of humans who had made meals in harsh environments. He felt a brief flicker of connection to those distant figures, imagining them kneeling beside campfires in deserts, mountains, and swamps. Survival was a craft, not a reaction. Every environment had a rhythm waiting to be learned. He set the bowl aside and began preparing a new batch of sliced plant roots. His knife moved with precise, steady cuts. The movements were almost meditative, shaped by the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over his reclaimed corner of the valley. He arranged the slices across the heated stone, listening to the faint hiss as moisture evaporated. The scent grew rich and earthy, carried by the rising columns of filtered air. Daniel felt a growing warmth, partly from the fire structures, partly from a quiet pride. He had done something no one else believed possible. He had turned a place marked forbidden into a place of nourishment. He worked for several more minutes before he sensed a shift in the haze above him. The smoke thinned in a wide, circular shape, not created by his filters, but disturbed by movement from the ridge. He heard faint echoes of voices. The instructors had finally realized he had gone too long without reappearing. Daniel did not look surprised. He simply adjusted the clay bowls, wiped his hands on a strip of bark, and waited. The approaching silhouettes descended cautiously, their movements slow and tense. The smoke parted reluctantly around them, creating uneven tunnels through which they advanced. Daniel watched the haze respond to his filters even when strangers passed through it, bending in smooth currents that guided the instructors toward the central clearing. The lead instructor stepped into the filtered pocket and froze. His posture shifted instantly from stern authority to stunned disbelief. He had expected danger, collapse, perhaps even an unconscious body. Instead, he found Daniel standing beside a fully functional cooking area, surrounded by structures that filtered air, regulated heat, and reshaped the valley's toxic environment. The instructor's eyes widened as he scanned the scene. Clay bowls lined the ground. Steam rose gently from a suspended stone. A neat ring of heated rock pulsed with reddish light. It looked less like a survival emergency and more like a primitive kitchen carved into a forgotten world. Daniel greeted him calmly, lifting one of the clay bowls. He extended it toward the instructor without a word. The instructor hesitated, but curiosity overrode caution. He accepted the bowl and inhaled the steam rising from it. Even through his protective mask, the scent reached him. He lowered the mask for a brief moment and tasted the broth. His expression changed, a blend of shock, admiration, and confusion. He took another sip before he even spoke. More instructors arrived, each one reacting similarly to the sight before them. They looked at the filtration towers Daniel had built, the mats layered with clay, the carefully shaped air channels, and the tripod over the stone stove. One instructor crouched beside a vent, feeling the warmth rise through the filter layers. He stood again with a bewildered expression, unable to understand how Daniel had not only survived, but established comfort in a place declared inhospitable for decades. Daniel remained silent, allowing the structures to speak for themselves. The lead instructor finally asked how long it had taken Daniel to create all of this. Daniel answered simply and calmly, explaining the process without embellishment. The airflow observations, the clay ceiling, the layered filters, the use of natural vents, the reshaping of smoke patterns. He described each step with clarity, emphasizing patience, instinct, and adaptability. He spoke as if he were explaining a familiar household task rather than a radical re-engineering of an environment the Academy had long deemed untouchable. As Daniel spoke, the instructors exchanged glances. Some carried embarrassment, others awe, and a few a subtle spark of intellectual excitement. The valley had not been hostile. It had been misunderstood. For years, the Academy had treated it as an uninhabitable hazard, a place where cadets were forbidden to step. Now they stood in the center of it, breathing filtered air and tasting hot broth, watching one human demonstrate what their instruments and assumptions had failed to uncover. One instructor stepped away from the group and walked the perimeter of the filtered pocket. He observed how the filtered air rose in controlled spirals, how the haze above thinned into structured layers, how the valley's chaotic atmosphere had been shaped into something predictable. He crouched near a clay-lined trench where smoke drifted sideways through a set of fiber mats. He placed his hand over the exit vent and felt the difference in temperature and density, a gentle, breathable stream of air that should not have existed in this place. The instructor rose slowly and looked at Daniel with a softened expression bordering on respect. The lead instructor took a deep breath, then tapped his wrist communicator with a decisive gesture. He called for the Academy's environmental specialists to prepare for a re-evaluation of the valley. His tone held no irritation now, only quiet recognition. Daniel's work had changed the status of this place. It was no longer a forbidden zone. It was a demonstration of ingenuity, a challenge to long-held assumptions, and a reminder that the boundaries of survivability were fluid, not fixed. Daniel listened to the instructor's words without reacting outwardly. He simply continued adjusting the mats above the stove ring, ensuring the airflow remained stable. The valley pulsed with warmth around him, no longer an enemy, but a collaborator. The other instructors stood observing the rising steam, the way it wove through the filtered air and disappeared into the higher layers of haze. None of them spoke again for several moments. They were too busy absorbing the implications of what they were witnessing. Eventually, the lead instructor addressed Daniel directly. His voice carried no reprimand now, only something almost like reverence. He told Daniel that his work would be documented, studied, and taught. He explained that the valley's classification would be reconsidered and that Daniel's filtration methods could lead to new advancements in field engineering and environmental management. Daniel nodded with quiet acceptance, though his expression remained calm and grounded. He did not crave recognition. He had simply followed instinct and curiosity to their natural conclusion. As the instructors prepared to escort him back to the ridge, Daniel took one last look at the camp kitchen he had built. The warm glow of the heated stones reflected through the haze. The clay bowls rested neatly beside the trench. The filtered air rose in steady circles, creating the illusion of a living heartbeat within the valley. Daniel felt a subtle sense of closure. He had entered a place that others feared and left it changed, not conquered, but understood. When he finally stepped onto the ridge again, the valley below looked different, even from a distance. The haze still drifted, but within it, faint columns of clean air shimmered like hidden lanterns. The cadets stared in open disbelief, whispering among themselves as they watched Daniel walk beside the instructors. The valley that had once represented danger now symbolized possibility. In the days that followed, the Academy updated its maps, replacing the word uninhabitable with a new designation. Adaptive Zone, Engineering Required. Daniel's name became attached to the revision. Specialists visited the valley to study his methods, replicating his structures and learning from the simple tools he had used. The valley, once abandoned to silence, became a living laboratory. Daniel never claimed ownership of the transformation. He simply watched as others entered the valley for the first time without fear. The filtered air moved around them in familiar spirals, guided by the structures he had built. The warmth of the stove ring radiated steadily, ready to cook, warm, or support whatever experiments came next. And so the valley remained, no longer a forbidden wasteland, but a testament to one quiet truth. Environments do not define limits. Minds do. And one human, with patience and ingenuity, had proven that even a place marked hopeless could breathe again. The valley exhaled clean air through the filters he had shaped, and Daniel walked away knowing that his work had redefined not only the land, but the expectations of everyone who had once feared it.